welcome to Historia Canadiana. My name is Patrick, and this is a podcast about Canadian culture, usually literature, and the way it interprets and informs this nation's history. Today, we are returning our gazes towards more fictional pieces of work, although, as we've seen in the past episodes, that has not stopped us from extrapolating very real themes from the texts. I'm actually not going to touch upon one specific author or text this time. Instead, I'm choosing to talk about a type of writing that emerged in Canada during the early days of the 17th and 18th centuries, that is, poetry. Through the verses produced in the Maritime provinces during this period, we're going to be looking at a region of Canada that we haven't really given its due yet, and we'll see how it fits into the early colonial era. This is going to be done through a few poets, including the likes of Henry Alline, Robert Hayman, Deborah Howe Cottenham, and Oliver Goldsmith. Today, we are specifically going to be looking at Newfoundland. Now, I know some of my Canadian listeners will be thinking, hey, Newfoundland isn't a maritime province. That's the other ones beside Quebec. I know that, but I'm lumping it in with the broad term of maritime province because of its proximity to the Atlantic. These next few episodes about early colonial poetry is going to get us onto discussions about loyalists, the French, the British, aristocracy, and of course the writing capabilities and sensibilities that each of them bring. For today, though, we are starting off a bit more smoothly with a part of Canada that was the very first to be settled by the British, and that was the last to join Canada. Newfoundland's early history is absolutely fascinating, so ladies and gentlemen, let's get cracking. As usual, let's begin with a bit of context so as to get us up to date with the period we want to cover today, that is, the mid to late 18th century. As listeners might recall, the French were still in control of a significant portion of North America prior to 1763, but that does not mean that the landscape didn't shift prior to that date. In fact, we will begin our story today around 1713 with what is known as the Treaty of Utrecht. This is an agreement between France and England to finally cede the colony of Nova Scotia, known as Acadia to the French, over to the latter. The details of Nova Scotia will be covered in a future episode, but I say finally because this has been an ongoing dispute for at least a century until that point. As the name of the colony indicates, there was a Scottish colonial claim to the territory since 1621. But, as we saw in the Samuel de Champlain episode a few weeks back, this did not stop the French from continuing to use Nova Scotia and other maritime areas for themselves as part of the settlement of what they called Acadia, or l'Acadie. After conquests and reconquests from both the French and the English sides, the matter was settled in 1713 in favor of the British. Another separate colony that came to be in full British possession after the treaty, but where they had had a presence for a very long time, was Newfoundland. Just east of Quebec, there was the very first permanent British colony on this continent. Newfoundland had quite the rocky start as a colony and was not very successful in the first part of the 17th century. This allowed the French to also settle the territory here and there, and it survived as barely more than a fishing hub for the British. But I mean barely more, since its ecology was very unsupportive of the European agricultural and permanent lifestyle. Prior to the arrival of permanent European settlements, much like everywhere else in North America, we can find many native populations, including the Innu, the Inuit, the Beothuk. These are a group of natives that have typically lived in the northern parts of Canada and who have their own stories and histories that I will be getting into soon, so keep posted for that. Much like many American civilizations at the start of European settlement, there was some trading and exchange done between the peoples from the two different continents. But the British were not, in fact, the first to interact with the native peoples of Newfoundland. Neither were the French, actually, despite Jacques Cartier providing one of the first written descriptions of that part of the continent in 1534. Before either, there were the Norse in the 11th century and the Basque in the early 16th century, who both came to Newfoundland to fish. It wasn't until later into the 16th and the early 17th century that the English would really start staking their permanent claim onto the land. This is where we will make our first literary pit stop of the episode, with the introduction of a certain Robert Hayman, the aristocrat who is credited with producing the first English poetry in what would become Canada. Now, how's that for a smooth segue? Despite being a relative failure for the late to the imperial game British, as compared to the other European colonial enterprises in America, the English still began establishing a system of governance that was similar to their own in the Newfoundland area. From 1618 to 1628, the governor of Newfoundland was the aforementioned Robert Hayman. The man was born in Devonshire and was educated at Oxford University. It was during his pre-governor days that he was interested in running among the literary circles of England. Having been in contact with the likes of Ben Jonson and John Donne most likely helped in his poetical interests, but very little is actually known about any work or significant endeavors that he was a part of prior to his life in the New World. Governor Hayman actually didn't stay permanently in Newfoundland. He stayed only during the summers and for one initial period of 15 months that was more extended than the few months that summer lasts here in Canada. As we will see when I read a few excerpts of the collection of poetry that Hayman published in London when his governorship expired in 1628, his brief stays were not because of a lack of admiration for the beauty or interest in the colony. He probably left because he could. To be perfectly honest, if I were in his position, I kind of get it. I love living in Canada, but I cannot stand the snow and cold. If I had the money to leave every winter, you bet your ass that I would take that chance. But until I get a governor position, I don't see that happening quite yet. Anyway, Hayman's returns to Britain are also indicative of the place that this colony, and later the other ones, had in the British mindset. It was not home yet. It was still an uncertain place filled with mystery, doubt, and peoples with which there were occasional alliances and occasional wars. Home was still Britain. Newfoundland was a third-class place to live at best. But, despite this reality, there is some admiration for the place that comes through the verses of Hayman's writing. We're going to see why later. I'm going to be reading two poems for you from the 1628 book entitled, in full, Quodlibets Lately Come Over from New Britannia, Old Newfoundland. Epigrams and other small parcels, both moral and divine. Oh, that was a mouthful. For those of you wondering, a quodlibet is an old and now unused term for a collection of short verses, songs, or poetry. Now, the spelling for some of these words, despite being a form of modern English, is different, as you might expect. And some of the words will not register in our vocabulary. We can still understand 99% of the words today, but if the meaning is really unclear, I'll try to define them after my reading. The first poem I am citing is found in Book 1 of Quodlibets, and is poem number 117. The guy sure had a lot of time on his hands. The first poem, and the second one that I'm going to be reading, are only a few verses long, and each of them are quite short, so I'm going to read them in full, and the first one goes a little something like this. A skeletonical continued rhyme, in praise of my newfound land, although in cloths, company, buildings fair, with England, Newfoundland cannot compare. Did some know what contentment I found there, always enough, most times somewhat to spare, with little pains, less toil, and less care, exempt from taxings, ill news, lawing, fear, if clean and warm, no matter what you wear, healthy and wealthy, if men careful are, with much, much more than I will now declare. I say, if some wise men knew what this were, I do believe they'd live no other where. So that was number 117. This second one is from book 2, actually, and is called, very simply, number 101. It's even shorter than the first one, so hang in there if you're not a poetry fan. To the first planters of Newfoundland, what aim you at in your plantation? Sought you the honor of our nation, or did you hope to raise your own renown, or else to add a kingdom to a crown, or Christ's true doctrine for to propagate, or draw salvages to a blessed state, or our o'er-peopled kingdom to relieve, or show poor men where they may richly live, or poor men's children godly to maintain, or aimed you at your own sweet private gain? All these you had achieved before this day, and all these you have balked by your delay. So this poetry is obviously very simple, but that's exactly what I would expect from the first forays to emerge from this country. Some recognizable themes are already oriented towards the mercantile, the natural, and the area where the hearts of the settlers lie. Are they English or something else already? These questions do not get developed fully in the verses, but in true poetic fashion, leave the door open for all kinds of questioning. He is obviously very willing to entice people to come and settle the young British colony, as, by his own admission when writing to King Charles I, he found the commodities to be base in their particulars, but that the people here were honest. Haman clearly hoped that by expounding a beautiful country that had an accommodating climate, in huge air quotes here, because 6 months of the year there's a ton of snow, he was hoping that the British colonialists wouldn't miss a chance to head on over in a heartbeat. It seems that Haman knew his book was rough and unpolished, but that he published it anyway so as to prove a point. That despite his own, quote, bad unripe rhymes, there was some literary potential for the new colony. To quote him again, "For I now, grown dull and age, could do somewhat, what will not sharper, younger, freer inventions perform there?" Basically, if he could produce this at his age, then what could younger men do? It's essentially a challenge. He was a rather conscious pioneer, both as a colonist and a poet, and this poetry shows this. This makes me think of something that we will see be a recurring motif, especially in early Canadian writing, and that's that Haman's writing seems like a slightly poorer attempt at what was being produced in Great Britain. We can point to the fact that he is British, of course, but there is also something else that we can pull out of this. The fact that Canada is very far from the so-called homeland becomes a difficulty for a significant part of the English-speaking population that will feel strong ties to Great Britain for many generations. Much like Haman is doing, there will be a lot of writers who aspire to capture these British-style literary and artistic movements, but who will constantly fall short because of the distance and lack of rapid communication. By the time a style hits big in Britain and is exported through the empire, the imperial subjects who want to produce art similar to this will always be a little late to the game. The same goes for Canada. Haman had the advantage of being able to repeatedly return to Britain and being in direct contact with its literary circle, but many do not, and that's something that is already evident here. I want to continue an examination of a later and more developed Newfoundland with writers like the Irish immigrant Doncha Rua Macconmara, who I will simply call Macconmara from now on for the sake of my throat's integrity and to avoid insulting any people in the audience who might speak Celtic. At the time of Macconmara, we are about 100 years after Hayman's stay, and things have not advanced that much in Newfoundland. Compared to the mouth of the St. Lawrence River and the Maritimes, the actual Maritimes, which had been consistently developed since before Hayman was governor by the French and English, as we saw in previous episodes, Newfoundland was quite slow to the finish line. The British, despite being open to settling the area, deliberately kept it to a minimum by not enforcing the establishment of a stable government as it had done in its other colonies, more to the south. As such, few people cared to live on the eastern coast of Canada. In such conditions, it's not surprising that a literary culture that is indigenous to that region would not develop easily. The few who did write did so in clumsy couplets, in the likes of Lacy's 1729 collection named Miscellaneous Poems Composed at Newfoundland. It is a much more somber and realistic outlook on Newfoundland, but it is frankly uninteresting. The poet I mentioned earlier, Macconmara, while not showing a lot more skill than Lacy, does allow us to discuss a bit more of the development of the future province. Macconmara was a Jacobite poet from Ireland who visited Newfoundland between 1745 and 1770. His poetry was a mix of English and the Irish language, which allowed him to recite pro-Jacobite and pro-Irish verse with impunity without having the English speakers around him who were not necessarily Jacobites or who weren't necessarily on board with Irish autonomy. They wouldn't know what he was saying while they were enjoying his poetry. This was, so it was recounted, to the great delight of many an Irish codfishers in the taverns of St. John's. I'll recite a bit of his poem entitled Doncha Rua in Newfoundland, before discussing what we can figure out from it. As mentioned, half the work is in English and the other in Irish, but I have an edition that has English translations. I will not be speaking the Irish parts in their original form. If you want to know what they are, either follow along on your own version or pinpoint the parts of the poem that are quite unfriendly to Newfoundland and the English, and that'll tell you what was written in Irish. Given that this is a much longer poem than the previous ones I cited, I'm just going to read a few excerpts here and there instead of reading the full, 3 or 4 pages that this is. So I'll skip a few verses and you'll be able to get an idea of the values that Macconmara is expounding. Here we go. As I was walking one evening fair, and I lately in St. John's town, I met a gang of English blades who had been cowed by opponents' might. I boozed and drank both late and early with these courageous men of war. A sweet sight was this fleeing English crew, as their Irish victors membered so few. Newfoundland is a fine plantation. It will be my station before I die. Oh, to be back in Ireland, selling garters rather than roaming wild. Here you may find a virtuous lady, a smiling fair one to please your mind. The worst old nags you would ever see, I'd give my life from them to be free. Come drink a health, boys, to Royal George, our chief commander, no servant of Christ. Beseech the blessed Mother on high to overcome this wretched crew. We'll fear no cannon nor war's alarm, while noble George will be our guide. O Christ, may I see the demon trounced by thy true son in exile yonder in France. So when we are talking about the various diasporas in Canada, especially in early Eastern Canadian history, it is nigh impossible to not at least mention the Irish. The most well-known set of Irish immigrants to come into Canada is most likely the Great Waves that came in through Grosse Île during and after the Great Famine. But the Irish have a longer history in Canada than this. In fact, The roots of Irish immigration can be traced back to the very period and location that Mac Conmara writes about. The cod fisheries that are laughed about in the poem I just read employed a great deal of Irish settlers who would often set up for long-term stays regardless of the limited seasonal work that cod fishing provided. Now, it was important for me to mention that Conmara was a Jacobite earlier, mostly because it shows the diversity of the people within the Irish community. We tend to think of the Irish in Canada within a dualistic mindset, as Irish Catholic or Ulster Protestants, or something along those lines. It probably works within our own framework of bilingualism in Canada, right? French and English, and I have a feeling we're trying to fit a lot of things within that duality, including the Irish. In this case, it kind of works, especially that Mac Conmara is speaking both Irish and English. So you see a lot of dualities here. Anyway, given the variety of places in Ireland that these immigrants come from, the multiple eras during which they arrive here, and the other diverse populations with which they mix, we are inevitably bound to fail in any clear definition of the Irish in Canada. They are simply too heterogeneous to make any attempt worthwhile. Jacobitism, especially the strand seen in Ireland, is actually more in line with and tolerant of Catholicism. Furthermore, they were a group which was pretty fervent in securing Irish autonomy from the British. This Jacobite attitude explains many of the jabs at the English in Mac Conmara's verses. He very directly points to the faults of the English king and the folly of the British settler policies. This is one of the reasons why I wanted to touch upon this poet. He goes against the idea that most early Canadian settlers were proud to be a part of the British Empire and an ideology that was rapidly becoming the most important in the world at the time. So, while there are some major through lines that we can certainly form with Mac Conmara, including his relation to the Irish diaspora, to multiculturalism, and even to a certain extent, like I mentioned, bilingualism, that Canada would make a foundational aspect of its culture, we must keep in mind that not everyone was on board with the British connection. This will become important later, especially when we will get to the Irish in Quebec, which is a province that has notoriously been difficult with its relation to British imperialism. We're going to leave the Irish there. It was very short, but so is the poem. And for now, there's not that much to say about the Irish in Newfoundland. I just wanted to establish this idea that they were more spread out in Canada than just around the maritime provinces and Quebec. We are actually going to be moving on to our next poet, which is going to kind of cap off the early colonial period in Newfoundland's history. I'm going to move on now to our final work, which would have been written around the same time as our Irish poet's comedic lines in 1745. Unfortunately, we actually don't know anything for sure about the author of this poem, which is called Nathaniel's Tilt, as they have remained anonymous throughout the years. There is some argument to be made that the person was a British officer stationed at the Bay of Bulls, as there are references to the naval officer who was in charge of the area at that time, named Nathaniel Brooks. The tilts that are referred to in the title and the verses are the types of homes built by Newfoundland fishermen. I'll speak more on that later, but for now, I think I'll just read the poem and let that sink in. I'll read it in its entirety because, like many of the other poems that come out in this period, including some that we've talked about today, it is very short. It's only about 2 verses long. So, without further ado, here's Nathaniel's Hilt by Anonymous. Not hardened bricks in mouldering flame prepared, nor Parian marble the proud fabric reared, no lofty turrets reaching to the sky, reproached the new-found soil with luxury, but poles and dirt, boxes of slaughtered cod. The sides composed, the roof was rinds and sod. At either end, his worship else had choked. A headless hogshead for a chimney smoked. Wild through the front 7 shattered windows stared, with paper some, and some with rags repaired. 4 sturdy poles, o'erlaid with twigs of birch, projecting from the entrance, formed a porch, profuse of odors. Here the housewife good her platter washed, and here the hog's trough stood, more odorous still before the sunny pile. Livers of fish lay rotting into oil. Less stunk that liver which near Toby's bed the angel burned when the choked devil fled. O Toby, hadst thou here first met thy bride, e'en then, perchance, the devil himself had died. Yet here o'er cods and men Nathaniel rules, the seat imperial of the Bay of Bulls. Now, just because the identity of the poet is lost to us does not mean that there is nothing else. The whole trend of the death of the author has taught me anything, it's that there is in fact a whole lot more to gather than just who the author was and what his intention was. The Hutzler poet makes the central imagery of his lines are an interesting way of finally touching upon the distinctive nature that is forming around Newfoundland. Where Matt Conmara does touch upon some characteristic traits, Nathaniel's Tilt really brings to our imagination a vision of Newfoundland that is rather unique and new. Right? The cod that is rotting in the oil to make the famous cod liver oil, and the fishermen that are using these huts to live in and that they would also use to smoke their cod or make, as I just mentioned, the cod liver oil inside them. It's actually the impressive quantity of smoke that emanated from these small habitations that led to the Newfoundland idiom, smoking like a tilt, which is used to refer to someone that smokes an egregious amount of cigarettes. So finally, by the mid-18th century, we are finally getting a distinctive feel for what Newfoundland is like and how it is developing its own group of people and traditions outside of the British and Irish who settled there. But they're not completely separate either. There are references to how Nathaniel rules and is the imperial seat of the Bay of Bulls. So there's still obviously an attachment. We're not completely independent from Britain. We're still attached to the empire, and there's still a sense of hierarchy. But there is something about the description of this anonymous poet that gives us a sense of this is its own community. Another thing worth mentioning is the higher education that our unknown poet, as well as the others that we talked about today, probably received. The classical style of writing and the references found in Nathaniel's Tilt to apocryphal books of the Bible seem to suggest a level of knowledge that the quote-unquote average settler would not necessarily have had. By the way, the reference to the apocryphal books of the Bible is when we mention Toby's bed and the angel burned is probably a reference to the book of Tobit, which is a book that is not canon in Bible scripture. Anyway, it's not much of a note, but it is something to keep in mind during these earlier colonial times. While settlers were not at all stupid, most of them simply would not have been able to or want to write poetry that is so clearly influenced here by the European styles of writing. I want to conclude this whole thing with just touching upon the heritage of this type of writing. While obviously poetry has changed in Canada and in Newfoundland specifically throughout the decades and centuries, there are still some remnants in terms of themes and the public that is aimed at in the work that's produced there, either in poetry or song or texts. For example, you can still see the imagery of the cod liver oil and the cod fisheries in popular songs. If you want to take, for example, Dick Nolan, who is a Newfoundland songster, and he has a whole series of albums called Newfoundland Songbook. And one of his more famous songs is Cod Liver Oil Song. The entire song is about a cod fisher who reminisces on very much of the same themes as the Irish Mac Conmara would have, laughing at, or rather depressingly thinking about the harsh life that he's living in Newfoundland, and thinking about his wife who is crying about the life that they're having and his destructive life as a fisherman in the cod business. So you get these themes that come back over and over again and that haven't really lost their sense of relevancy within the Newfoundland context. I don't want to give the idea that the legacy of Newfoundland songs and poems is just depressing. It's just one example among many that has the same themes that carry over into, well, at this point, it would have been an album that came out in the 90s. So it's still in the mindset of that province, although sometimes you will find some that are a bit more joyful. And this whole style that he actually uses is very much folk-oriented and would have been in a style that, much like Mac Conmara, would have been played in more of a pub style, right, and would have played to more of a folk public. But that being said, this should just about conclude the episode for this week. We will probably be returning to Newfoundland later from a different perspective, but for now we'll leave it at poetry. It's quite impressive actually to realize just what we can learn from a few lines of poetry about a developing colony and the people living in it. It is a completely different and much shorter approach than the exploration texts that we covered in the last two episodes, but it's nevertheless a very rich resource. We saw today the various populations who would have interacted in Newfoundland, as well as the perspectives that they bring on the British Empire. Most importantly, I think, we come to understand just how disparate these opinions could be, which is not the typical image that we would have of a place that would later come to see itself as a relatively single culture that is divided up in underneath an umbrella of multiculturalism. I know that sounds contradictory to say a single culture within the multicultural mind frame, but we'll get to that. Anyway, in the next 2 weeks, we're going to cover a different aspect of the country and its poetry, that is the more maritime provinces. So keep posted for that. And that being said, thanks everyone for listening. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always email them to me at historiacanadiana@gmail.com. I'm also on Twitter at CanLitHistory. If you want to reach out to me through there, that's fine. You can also suggest topics and themes that you would like to hear me explore in the future. And finally, if you would consider leaving a review, even if there are no comments, it would be very appreciated. It really does help. So with that being said, I'll see you next time on Historia Canadiana. Cheers, everyone.